As we prepare to confirm a new Attorney General, I'd like to speak about keeping this country safe and the rule of law. And I'd like to speak about three issues in particular. Number one, the threat this country faces is real, and it is a threat from radical Islamic terrorism. It is a threat, unfortunately, that the prior administration engaged in willful blindness for 8 long years. Indeed, the Oversight Subcommittee of this committee conducted a hearing where we heard from a whistleblower at the Department of Homeland Security that described how the previous administration scrubbed the records at DHS to remove any reference to Muslim Brotherhood, to radical Islam, to alter and delete roughly 800 records, to be blind to the threat we face. And indeed, this threat is real. I would note a letter that I joined with Jeff Sessions in 2015 and again in 2016 and again another in 2016, pointed out that our investigation identified at least 40 individuals who since September 11th were initially admitted to this country as refugees, who were subsequently convicted of or implicated in terrorism. This is a real problem, and it's an ongoing problem. I would note in France, reading from the Washington Post in April of 2016, quote, "On a crisp morning last October, 198 migrants arrived on the Greek island of Leros. Hiding among them were 4 men with a very different agenda. The 4 were posing as war-weary Syrians." And the Washington Post goes on to note that those refugees who came in went on to carry out the, quote, "worst attack on French soil since World War II." As for vetting, James Comey, the director of the FBI, who I would note was appointed to that position by President Barack Obama, told the United States House of Representatives that vetting was ineffective, in particular in the Syrian war zone. He said, and I quote, "We can only query against that which we have collected. If someone has never made a ripple in the pond in Syria in a way that would get their identity or their interest reflected in our database, we can query our database until the cows come home. But we are not going to. There will be nothing to show up because we have no record on that person." Given that the FBI has told us they cannot vet refugees coming from war zones where there is a serious and persistent problem with radical Islamic terrorism, the threat is real, and for 8 years, we had an administration that was willfully blind to that threat. Indeed, that was, I believe, one of the major issues in this past election, is the American people wanting a president and administration that would prioritize protecting this country and keeping this country safe. The second point I would make, there's been much focus on the President's executive order concerning refugees. I would note that the heart of that order is a common sense step that the vast majority of Americans support. Now, you wouldn't know this from the hysterics and hair on fire that we see on the media, but the heart of that order is a 4-month pause in refugee programs until effective vetting can be implemented. And I would note that that follows quite similarly to legislation I introduced in this previous Congress, legislation called TRIPA that would impose a moratorium on refugees coming from countries where ISIS or Al-Qaeda control substantial territory. That is a basic common sense step, and indeed another component of it that has generated considerable consternation among our Democratic colleagues is the fact that President Trump's order reverses the 8-year pattern of discrimination against persecuted minorities, in particular Christians in the Middle East. The blindness of the Obama administration to the plight of Christians in the Middle East is one of the great tragedies of the modern day. Syrian population is roughly 10% Christian, and yet fewer than 1% of the refugees admitted from Syria are Christian. That is all the more striking given that ISIS is engaging in systematic torture, persecution, oppression, and genocide targeted at Middle East Christians. And although you would never get it watching the mainstream media, what this order did quite reasonably was focus on persecuted religious minorities and end the Obama pattern of de facto segregation against Middle Eastern Christians. But then we come to the actions of the last 24 hours at the Department of Justice and the actions of the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates. We have heard a number of Democratic colleagues on this committee praise Sally Yates's actions as somehow admirable. I will say it is sad that Sally Yates's conduct in the last 24 hours is entirely consistent with 8 years of a lawless Obama Department of Justice. Now, several have said at this hearing that an attorney general is obliged to be independent to stand up to a president who instructs him or her to disregard the law. That is absolutely correct. That is the obligation of the attorney general to follow the law. But this order had explicit statutory authorization. Indeed, the text of Title 8 of the United States Code, Section 1182F, reads as follows, quote, "Whenever the President finds that the entry of any aliens or of any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interest of the United States, he may, by proclamation and for such period as he deems necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem to be appropriate." That is explicit statutory authority. This executive order was promulgated pursuant to that explicit statutory authority. And when the acting Attorney General, an Obama holdover, instructed the Department of Justice to refuse to defend the President's order, it was an act of brazen partisan lawlessness. It was not based on law. It was based on a policy disagreement. Ms. Yates apparently agrees with President Obama and her predecessors at the Department of Justice that allowing unvetted refugees into this country who the FBI has told us they cannot ascertain whether or not they're terrorists, that is a policy mandate, and that the safety and security of Americans is less important than that. That action was nothing short of lawlessness, and I will notice once again, I am always pleased to see my colleagues on either side of the aisle speaking up for rule of law. I'm curious where these sentiments calling for an independent attorney general were in 2009 and 2010 and 2011 and 2012 and 2013 and 14 and 15 and 16. Because for the life of me, I cannot recall a single instance in which Eric Holder or Loretta Lynch stood up to Barack Obama on anything. Time after time after time, when the IRS illegally and impermissibly targeted American citizens based on their political views, the Attorney General refused to appoint a special counsel and instead assigned the case to a major Democratic donor who had given over $6,000 to Barack Obama and the Democratic Party. That was lawless. It was brazen. It was partisan. Repeatedly at this committee, I asked both Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch, would you appoint a special counsel who is not a major Democratic donor to investigate the Obama IRS using the powers of government to persecute those who disagree with the president? They both defiantly refused to do so. And nary a peep was heard from any of our Democratic colleagues on this committee. Not a word of criticism was heard from that. I would note, I agree that the Senate should stand up to any president who's disregarding the law, and I have a record as the Solicitor General of Texas of standing up to George W. Bush, a president of my own party, and indeed arguing before the United States Supreme Court that an order he entered in the case of Medellin versus Texas was contrary to the law and contrary to the Constitution. I would inquire of this committee when the Democratic members in the last 8 years ever raised any issue with President Obama's assertion of unlawful authority and the Department of Justice's complicity in it. You know, the Department of Justice has a long and bipartisan tradition on both Republican and Democratic sides of staying out of politics. I'm proud to be an alumnus of the department, as are many on this committee. And it is fitting that the end of the Obama DOJ was Sally Yates defying a president, refusing to follow the law, and giving the president no other choice but to relieve her of her duties. I commend President Trump for firing Sally Yates last night. When an attorney general decides that her partisan political commitments are more important than following the law, that acting attorney general gives the president no choice but to relieve them of their duties. And I would encourage this committee to move expeditiously in confirming an attorney general, Jeff Sessions, someone we all know, someone we all respect, and someone who will be faithful to the law, faithful to the Constitution, not following a political agenda, as sadly has been the record of Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch and Sally Yates, but instead being faithful to his oath to defend the Constitution and defend the rule of law. With that, I yield the floor.